Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger's supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we're doing the epilogue for Fractured Families. He was cold. Justin desperately wanted to throw a thermal blanket over himself to preserve his body heat, but the Sayatoga could detect that. Not that he knew where they were. They'd probably left already, thinking him dead. But he wasn't taking a chance. He hadn't remained alive all this time by being careless. The Sayatoga sensor were sensitive enough to detect any kind of body heat. He'd gotten the operator to confirm that when he became captain. He didn't want any chance of a prisoner escaping and drawing attention to the Sayatoga. And Tristan accused him of not knowing how things work. Tristan. He growled his breath, his teeth chattering. This was his fault. He had no idea how he'd done it, but he'd put that little team together and gotten them to steal his ship. His brother was probably sitting in his chair right now, looking all smug. It had all been a trick. Somehow he'd faked the drug's effect. He wondered if Isabel had been in on it, but dismissed the idea. She was too interested in seeing what chemicals did on the body and mind to care about Tristan's plans. It had been Tristan and that bounty hunter. He should have realized it the moment she contacted them with the bounty. But Crimson had been a good value. That he'd ended up being Tristan's pet human had been too much of a surprise. Tristan didn't normally keep pets. He was the use and throw away type. Pets were Justin's things. He should have gotten that bounty hunter assassinated the moment he'd had access to the coercionist. She deserved nothing else for delivering him onto the Sayatoga, but he'd wanted to make her suffer, take away everything she valued, her work, her reputation. He should have killed her after a few years of that, but he'd gotten busy running his ship and had forgotten about her. Now that he thought about it, it made sense. She'd been part of the rescue. She was probably another pet Justin hadn't known about. Not that his brother normally went for women. That was another of Justin's thing he was stealing. It had all been arranged from the start. Not an accident that she'd taken him instead of Tristan. She'd probably been the one to change the records so they'd match his brother. It wasn't like his brother was smart enough. He was all muscle and explosives. Tristan didn't have any finesse about him. Still, he was alive. That was the important thing. Tristan had screwed up, but didn't know it. That gave Justin the advantage. He shivered, and he didn't think it was entirely from the cold in the dark shuttle. He checked the mask over his face for any leak. It had been expensive, but worth the money. Not many models were made to seal through fur. He pulled on the tube until the canister was in his hand, and he shook it. Did it feel empty? Maybe his hair was getting thin. How long since he changed a canister? Too long, probably. He felt at his belt and there was only one left. He cursed. Had the others somehow gotten loose and floated away? He felt for the light and sighed in relief. It was still there. If only he could turn it on. But the sensor could detect the faintest trace of power. He'd gotten the operator to admit that, too. He hated to admit it, but luck had played a part in his survival. He didn't know how they'd been able to avoid the hangar, since the safeguard should have kicked in the moment he left the bridge and locked them out. The coder he'd brought in to look over the other coder's work had assured him that it would do that. Then he'd killed both to make sure no one would find out about it. It hadn't all been luck, he reminded himself. Part of it had been training. After almost dying the first time Tristan blew up his station, he'd undergone intense training in void survival. The luck part was that he'd been thrown at his shuttle instead of away from it. He'd had an oxygen mask just by the ramp specifically for such an occasion. The moment he'd grabbed onto the ramp's frame, he'd snatched it and had it on. After that, he'd searched the ship by feel and gathered what he'd need to survive. He'd wanted to just leave, but knew the propulsion exhaust could be tracked. He didn't remember how that part had been so dull. He felt like strangling that technician, but he knew it could be, so he had to hunker down and wait until they left. There was no chance they'd find him unless he radiated heat or powered something on. He'd made sure his ship didn't have an override code and that the tag was on only when he wanted it on. He scratched at his arm and thought he felt fur fly off. He had to be majorly stressed if he was shedding so much. Not that he should be surprised. He'd almost died, been exposed to vacuum longer than a mere human could survive, and they considered him inferior because he wasn't all skin. He shuddered. Sure, there was something sensual about running a hand over such smooth surfaces, but to be furless? They could keep that. How long until he could turn the heat on? Better yet, the gravity. He was tired of keeping an arm hooked around the chair to keep from floating away. He also needed the light to figure out where everything had floated away to. More than any of that, he wanted the washroom. Fuck, he needed to take a leak so bad. And this concludes Fractured Families. If you've been enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next book is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read that coming book, as well as the other in the series, they are available on all major e-retailers. If you want a different way to support me, that is on my Patreon, where you can get access to just about everything I've written. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.